It is with great joy that I welcome new friends and old together here for a third Dante Salon, and that we will then in London gather again. July 13th and 14th, if you don't know already, we will have a panel with William and John and David, and I will be in the happy position of just kind of redirecting questions and bringing us all together once again. But it is my great joy to introduce you to you today, our friend William Franke. William has a very brief bio that he gave me. You can certainly read more. But William Franke is a philosopher of the humanities. He is going to today present his ideas from his book on Dante's Vita Nuova and the New Testament, Hermeneutics and the Poetics of Revelation, from Cambridge University Press 2021. We have essays in our previous Dante and the Other Phenomenology of Love, a wonderful work. And in our last gathering together, we were playing with themes of apophatic spirituality and what can and can't be said. And those discourses continue today. So please, let's welcome William Franke.
Okay, well, an immense thanks to Aaron for continuing organizing all of these conferences. At the very beginning, it was Dante and Phenomenology. When you first wrote me, I remember I was in New York at that time, and that was a good hook. And I've really stayed on that theme. Since then, I've actually read the Vita Nuova, developed a reading of the Vita Nuova as a kind of inaugural text of phenomenology. The book that you mentioned, which I'm going to try to summarize in some, well, not really summarize, but to pick out a few ideas today, is this book, which, as you said, 2021, but it just came out in paperback. This is for you, Aaron.
Thank you.
As a token of gratitude. There we go. Yeah, okay. Yeah, phenomenology. Somehow or other, the science of consciousness, or maybe a hermeneutic theory of consciousness. In any case, it's a matter, I think, of trying to bring together some sense of the given. What is it? The world experience, something that's given, together with our processes of reflecting on that. And when then phenomenology takes the theological turn, especially in France, right, with Levinas and Michel Henry, Jean-Luc Marion, the phenomenological project really turns in this theological direction, which I think makes Dante's project very relevant. I want to think now about the event of Beatrice in Dante's life and try to understand this phenomenologically. Encountering Beatrice is inspirational and induces in Dante an otherwise unattainable state of exaltation and self-expropriation. It leads to a reorientation of his existence and a new exalted dimension in his experience of life. A new life, right? La Vita Nuova, as the title of the book says. Dante's Beatrice is literally his beatifier, right? That's really what the word means. This name functions also as a common noun beginning with a lowercase letter. Dante mentions that many people that didn't know what her name was, they would just call her Beatrice, right? As if being in her presence was an experience of being blessed and beatified, that spontaneously that name came to their lips. Dante's sense of Beatrice as his beatifier, then, is communicated to him directly by his lady's greeting, her saluto. And this word is entangled linguistically with the vocabulary for salvation, salute. It literally means health in modern Italian, but also very much in a spiritual sense. So the idea of salvation, salute, in the greeting, saluto, graces or haunts the work all throughout. It becomes really an obsession of Dante's. And his phrase, when this most gentle salvation saluted, quando questa gentilissima salute salutava, plays on the double meaning of salutare as conferring both a greeting and salvation. Dante tells us that in his lady's salutations dwelt his beatitude. Now, appearing to Dante in the image and in the salvific role of Christ, Beatrice leads Dante to, and even in some sense is, the new life. In this regard, she's strikingly like the one who proclaims himself the way, the truth, and the life, both the protagonist and the propagator of a new and blessed life. Her name and greeting concertedly announce such a quasi-evangelical good news to Dante, who in turn transmits to us, his readers, what is in essence the good news according to Dante. Right? This is Dante's gospel. And like the Gospels, in their narration of Christ's effects on his disciples and on those he encounters, the Vita Nuova recounts essentially the effects of Beatrice on those who behold her, and particularly on how she transforms Dante. When she's on the point of greeting him, a spirit of love takes over, chases away the spiritelli, the spirits of, the sensible spirits for perceiving in this medieval physiology. And he perceives her through love, right? The spirit of love takes over. He becomes possessed by this spirit of love. He's beside himself, out of his mind, so to speak, out of his normal senses. He's overcome by a sentiment of charity and humility, such that he could consider no one to be his enemy. He would immediately pardon whoever had offended him. And this is not his temperament as we know it from his other works. This is an exceptional state for him. He's a cantankerous character, if ever there was one. But all this indicates then the miracle that Beatrice brought about in him. Actual physical detail about her appearance is neglected, just as is physical description of Christ in the Gospels. We're told only a few symbolic features about her eyes as the beginning of love, the smile as the end of love, and even these features are described not objectively, but stereotypically, and most significantly in terms of their love-inspiring effects on whosoever should behold her. The description is always self-reflectively about what Dante sees and experiences, not directly about Beatrice herself. All the ends of his beatitude, he says, tutti I termini della mia beatitudine, appear to him when he beholds Beatrice. And this phrase in particular, perhaps unwittingly, I think evokes eschatological time, the time of the end, the eschaton, literally. Or rather, the eschaton's obliteration of historical time. This time, of course, is Dante's experience or feeling of a final consummation of blessedness in her presence. Now, his reactions to Beatrice are distilled into the sigh, sospiro, that is the final word of the central sonnet, Tanto Gentile, where he really formulates his doctrine in the most memorable terms. And this sigh then becomes the vehicle of Dante's ascension to a supersensible vision of Beatrice in the Empyrean at the work's end, in the last poem, oltre la sfera, beyond the sphere that turns most widely, passes the sigh that issues from my heart. The sigh ascends to the ineffable vision of Beatrice beatified. Dante experiences Beatrice as an epiphany of the miraculous and divine, of something that is beyond all finite experience of objects and that cannot be adequately expressed in reductively objectivizing terms. This experience issues in the writing of poetry that bears witness to Dante's total transformation. The event of Beatrice conveyed in the Vita Nuova is something that could never even in principle be adequately related by mere prose as a sequence of even quite extraordinary facts. And hence the work's character as hybrid, right? It's a prosimetron, prose and poetry together. Dante needs the prose in order to ground the event in his life story as an historically existing individual, but he needs the poetry to capture and convey the inspired or transcendent meaning of this experience. And likewise, the revelation of Jesus as the Christ in the Gospels could not be given in the form of merely objective historical facts. Instead, the revelation of divinity is inextricably bound up with the disciples' personal experience in relation to Jesus, and with their lyrical poetic expression of it in the New Testament, its hymns, prayers, doxologies, as well as in the narrative itself. And what their testimony witnesses to is a faith that Jesus inspired in them. This faith was never compulsory in reaction to who Jesus was or what he did. It's a free response, requiring a willing and total commitment of self. Even seeing him after the resurrection as he ascends from the mountain in Galilee, they worshipped him and some doubted. So, there's an element of faith in this seeing. It requires an inner act or decision. The stories about Jesus in the Gospels witness not just to outward happenings, but more fundamentally to the miraculous transformations worked within the lives and hearts of the individuals who encountered him. Such is the deep significance, for example, of the miracle stories, namely what they say about the miraculous effect of Jesus of Nazareth on those who experienced him. I don't know, Bartimaeus, blind man, calling out, Jesus of Nazareth, have mercy on me. And then, what would you have me do? That my sight be restored. And so then Jesus does restore his sight. The way in which these stories are told typically emphasize that the miracle has already taken place, the miracle of faith. He's transformed inwardly. His whole life is changed, and then as a kind of ratification and a seal on this event, he receives his outward sight as well. I mean, the same thing for the leper, Jesus, as he passes along. And Jesus says, thy faith has healed thee. And then Jesus touches him, and the leprosy disappears. And I think that to make Jesus' divinity something more objective than this, to treat it as a purely objective fact, is to mythologize it. And I don't mean by this that it's untrue. I take myth as encoding existential, experiential reality and giving it a literary form of expression. And actually, I don't want to deny a certain objectivity, but the objectivity is always correlated with a subjective dimension as well. And so I think such a sense of myth, literally muthos, story in Greek, is in the spirit of C.S. Lewis's dictum that the heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. By becoming a fact, it does not cease to be a myth. That is the miracle. The fact in question here, I would submit then, is not so much of the order of a first-degree empirical fact, a sensory perception, but rather a fact that is constructed through the commitment of a life. A life can, in fact, be built on a myth or story that is adhered to and is made to become the truth of an individual's own existence. In such terms, the Vita Nuova, the story of Dante's relation to Beatrice, can be read as Dante's founding myth. Now, while it's natural and fulfills certain emotional needs that Dante should express the experience of Beatrice in the hyperboles and wish-fulfilling fantasies of myth, they must be understood to be interpretations revealing his personal experience as a subject. And this means that in crucial ways, the truest or most authentic expression of this emotionally overwhelming experience must remain the lyric. Dante's lyrical language about Beatrice directly embodies his emotional exaltation and the existential reality of his ecstatic self-transcendence in relation to her. Lyrical language can achieve this by virtue of its formal aesthetic properties, its musical qualities, and its emotional expressiveness in excess of representational content or objective reference. The lyric form is indispensable for expressing what was felt and experienced in relation to the miraculous, divinity-revealing individual. I think this holds for the New Testament as well as for the Vita Nuova. Without lyrical expression and crystallization, there could have been no more than a passing individual illumination, not a historical, life-transforming revelation, because the transcendent meaning of the event could not have been communicated or even formulated. The miracle of Beatrice lies in what her presence works within the hearts and minds of others, not in what is factually documentable about her. And Christ, you look, on the plains of Palestine, you see a man. It takes this personal engagement in order to experience divinity. So there can be no objective descriptive language, objects being given always within the parameters of the given world to describe what Dante experiences with Beatrice. But there is lyrical language and expression, and this is what Dante employs. This subjective and personal dimension, harboring the effect that Beatrice had on Dante, can be conveyed only indirectly and lyrically to a reader or to any other person. Lyrical language does this specifically by suggesting the quality of feeling or the level of intensity that was touched in the experience. Without such lyrical language, all that could be said would be, we had the experience but missed the meaning. Yet thanks to the expressive power of lyrical language, another possibility arises, namely that, another quote, approach to the meaning restores the experience in a different form. And of course, that's T.S. Eliot, The Dry Selvages. Now, Dante, then, is not simply reporting an act of perception of an object, so much as he is expressing and actualizing an episode of personal witness. Dante's subjective language of witness is flagged by the expression pareami, or mi parve, it appeared to me, that accompanies all of the visionary appearances of Beatrice. It indicates subjective but also visionary experience that modulates fluidly from the domain of perception to that of belief, and thence to the register of decision about meaning, and so finally to action. It serves as witness to a subjective transformation undergone in an encounter with a superlatively significant other person. Whereas typically the language of appearing delimits the validity of the perceptions it conveys, in all of Dante's encounters with Beatrice, such language signals a superior degree of truth, the revelation of a higher transcendent reality. After the death of Beatrice, in the scene where the consoling lady appears to Dante, the pareami idiom, or appears to me, it hardly occurs, only very rarely, and it doesn't have the same significance that it does in every in every instance of Dante's encounters with Beatrice, or even with the god love, which is also a kind of transcendent experience. Every revelatory experience, Dante uses this appearing vocabulary. In the case, in chapter 35, of the compassionate lady, after Beatrice's death, Dante simply sees this lady. She's looking at him from a window. And as a framing device, I think the window separates and cordons off the object from the perceiving subject. The window serves as an image for the objective outward-turned perception that characterizes the scene. It implies a logic of objectification and even of self-objectification. And this is then the very antithesis of the captivating relation to a superlatively significant other in self-oblivion and self-transcendence, such as occurs in every instance in which Dante encounters and enters into relation with Beatrice. However, Beatrice has at this point departed and can no longer be experienced as physically present. Dante has to be tested by another experience of a beautiful woman who is physically present in order to fully grasp and affirm his unique visionary experience of Beatrice. I think he learns now the difference. When Dante encounters the gentle lady, she too is young and beautiful, not to say tempting. He is vulnerable to seduction precisely because he thinks of Beatrice as belonging to pastime, rather than to an immediate phenomenal appearing in the present. He writes, sometime afterwards it appeared to me that I was in a place where I remembered past time, and I remained long in meditation and in painful thoughts. He's sinking into nostalgic melancholia, and this eclipses his true vision of Beatrice's eternity and of her revelation of a new life in the present of his personal existence. He's treating Beatrice's revelation to him in a visionary present as merely a past fact. But by this route, he loses it as the true and present and ultimately religious experience that it is for him. So if we compare then the language of the episode of Dante's encounter with the other woman, right, this compassionate, pitying lady, to the language that Dante uses with the reapparition of Beatrice 4 chapters later, this is now 39, in an immaginazione, she comes to him, maybe it's some kind of a dream, in any case, it's a vision. The contrast, I think, becomes all the more apparent. The language of witness reappears in full force with all the personalized intensity of mi parve, pareami, to describe Beatrice's appearance to Dante. Dante now receives a visionary intervention from his lady, which is necessary to reaffirm him in his original faithfulness, his love and loyalty to her. I seemed to see this glorious Beatrice, mi parve vedere, we're back within this epiphanic mode, and it emphatically personalizes and subjectivizes perception as based on self-reflection and an interiorized mode of vision or rememoration. This self-reflective mode is discovered and developed essentially through Dante's making of poetry. Now, under the sign of epiphany mediated by self-reflection, Dante had announced as his new and more noble matter for poetry, a poetry achieving beatitude strictly through the words praising his lady. All right, this is his new strategy for poetry. It's only praise with no ulterior motives. The new and more noble matter, as he puts it, is superior in that he can give it to himself and he can control it entirely. He makes poetry a totally self-reflexive and apparently self-contained production. And yet, at the same time, it's still wholly dedicated to Beatrice, the other, only to praise her. And it's also given to him by the God love. It's the God love, he says, who informs him that this is now the new way for him to make poetry. So Dante stages a close correlation and even a coinciding between his own self-reflection and his being inspired from beyond himself, or his being beholden to a mysterious otherness in his description of how he comes to this original style of praise poetry. This is about chapter 18. He's made to stop and reflect by the fact of his own consternation in the presence of Beatrice. The ladies attending her, they mock him. He falls to pieces every time. So why does he even try to put himself in his presence, in her presence? And this does cause him some perplexity. And he reflecting on this, pensando molto, how is he going to proceed? Conversing with himself, this is the self-reflexive language that he uses, he reaches a resolution to seek his blessedness in nothing other than the words of praise for his lady. But then, unaccountably, he receives the first words for what was to become the manifesto poem of the new style and manner of poetry, walking by a clear stream, right, some sort of a symbol for inspiration. Walking by that clear stream, he's overwhelmed by a spontaneous upsurge of words. His tongue speaks as of its own accord, no? Come per se stessa mossa, and his tongue enunciates the incipit of ladies who have intelligence of love, the first manifesto poem then of the sweet new style. So striking in these descriptions is how this experience of otherness is yoked to a conscious practice of self-reflection in the cultivation of his art. Inspiration here goes hand in hand with Dante's own disciplined craft and deliberate creation. After receiving the inspired incipit, he spends several more days reflecting again before continuing the canzone and therewith launching his new style. I think he's adumbrating here the far-reaching theme of revelation as realized concretely in and through reflection. This is really my thesis, trying to see how these two are absolutely inseparable. The hybridization of inspiration and reflection opens to view what is at stake at the heart of the Vita Nuova in its immense inaugural significance. I think foreshadowed here is the historical destiny of literary inspiration to take up the relay from religion in revealing to us our own deeper reality as something inscrutably other than and in excess of ourselves. A telling illustration that condenses into a nucleus this compenetration of reflection and inspiration is found in chapter 34 about the anniversary of Beatrice's death. The chapter depicts Dante plunged deep into thought about Beatrice. He's designing an angel, right on the 1 year anniversary of her death. And his meditation, again, becomes equivalent to receiving something of a visitation. He becomes suddenly aware of the unsuspected presence before him of men to whom honor was due. He explains to them that another was with me just now, therefore I was thinking, right? That presence of the other together with the self-reflective act of thinking. Dante's thinking here is his communing with a higher reality or revelation, and the visitors who startled Dante out of his musings recall the three men honored as guests by Abraham at Mamre, and traditionally interpreted as a theophany of the Holy Trinity. Absorbed in his own reflection, Dante is visited by divinity, though he realizes this only later. This episode, on the anniversary of Beatrice's death, illustrates how memorialization, or what is often called recollection in a religious vocabulary, can function as a sacred rite and accomplish a sort of revelation through the self-reflective process of ceremonial remembrance that is such an important constituent of religious rites and cults. Memorialization, paradoxically, makes divinity present, but as absent, right? Rigorous reflection reveals the transcendent nature of the divinity to be ungraspable in whatever concrete finite terms. Reflection exposes a necessary emptiness, since divinity is transcendent, but this opens a space for the infinite or holy. Humanly, it can be filled only through meditation or relationships with others, acts of love and service. Medieval pilgrimage rites, proceeding paradigmatically to an empty tomb, offer a liturgical performance of such reflective or recollective work, liturgy, liturgos. The very emptiness of positive physical presence turns commemorative religious rites in the direction of an openness to others and to the other, which may even be understood to be divine. Now, as the final segment of this argument, I wish to point to some enigmatic features of the Vita Nuova that become more intelligible in light of Dante's discovery of self-reflective subjectivity as an infinite abyss that opens from within him and that opens him outward toward an infinite other. In the first place, a rather hysterical secretiveness on Dante's part about his beloved reads as a symptom of this unsettling discovery of the precariousness of the self-reflective subject. Unconsciously, Dante is not so much keeping secret the name of his beloved as he is hiding the bottomless abyss in himself that gapes open with the act of self-reflection in its infinite self-transcendence towards his divine ideal. This ideal, like the God of negative theology, remains necessarily beyond the reach of his knowledge and understanding. It is an object only of his striving and aspiration. There's some other symptoms of this awkwardly foundationless condition of the subject. For example, Dante's focus on clothes. Beatrice appears to him practically as her clothing, right? The red gown that she, when she's 9 years old, or the dazzlingly white garment that at 18 years old when she salutes him, and then there's the dream, the blood red sheet that covers her over. These clothes or covering serve as veils for a body that vanishes and is ungraspable as such. This mode of representation may betray a suspicion on Dante's part that, in a certain sense, beneath his image of her, there's perhaps nothing more substantial than a reflection of his own wishing and projecting. But this he must keep secret even from himself. Let me just be clear. I don't mean that then Beatrice doesn't exist, she's unreal, but that Dante's Beatrice, what he represents to himself, that he has to realize is his figment. His obsession with secretiveness is a sign of something supremely important about the process of self-reflection that he's discovering and pioneering for modern literature and culture. Introspective psychological reflection can be fastened hold of here, making a historically significant leap. An inner realm of experience is opened up to Dante by self-reflection, but since at the same time as it is exposed as a realm precisely of self-reflection, as a purely subjective act, it is unstable and susceptible of vanishing into nothing. The more consciousness reflects on itself, the more it realizes that it grasps only its own subjective impressions and not any objective reality. The elusiveness and vulnerability of the modern subject, as purely a product of self-reflection, is the legacy that is anticipated here and that will prove to be so essential to the making of the modern novel. Unlike its predecessors, the modern novel privileges a subjective point of view. It focuses on how events are lived and experienced by characters rather than simply on the events themselves for their own sakes. Right? In the ancient epic, you have the res gestae, the heroic works in a public arena, and the medieval romance based on the series of marvelous adventures. But in the modern novel, starting with Don Quixote, it's really the protagonist's subjective experience which carries the whole burden of the novel. And it's his crazy experience then, which gives the impetus to all of the ludicrous episodes that occur. And the founding of the world of the novel on the experience of the subject makes it insecure, for the subject taken in itself is a void. And Hamlet would be another exemplar here. His liability to annihilation through self-reflection. His comes out famously in his to be or not to be, his melancholic reflections and his self-reproaches. Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I. In each of these classic texts, the protagonists have to be beaten back symbolically and literally to the threshold of death before coming to this saving insight into their own constitutive and founding relation to an absolute, or at least an absolutely shattering alterity. Through this relation, they discover that their own egos, as enclosed by self-reflection, are null and void. And this epiphany then frees them to love and act with infinite commitment of their whole existence in relation to others. These epic-making texts of the modern era are the Vita Nuova's heirs in the discovery of the nullity of the self in itself and its consequent breaking open to all possible plenitude in and through relationships with others. It's only the relations to others and ultimately to the absolutely other that can lend the subject substance and secure its existence. You have the Cavalcantian poems that are very portray that self-destructiveness. You have the Gabbo, Dante's being mocked. He has a near-death experience. delirious. We see him really going to the 0 point. And this emptiness and nullity of the self, purely and merely in itself, by a certain intrinsic necessity, breaks the self open to others and makes it susceptible to the commanding presence of the other, which is Beatrice. It could be God, it could be love as a God. But corresponding now, symmetrically, to the absolute emptiness of the self purely in itself is an uncanny holy other beyond the reach of speaking, an ineffable other who cannot be said at all without being betrayed. Because reflection reveals that the other is inevitably betrayed by being said, since to say it is to appropriate otherness into one's own discourse and conceptual framework, and thereby to annul or encroach on its absolute otherness. The unsettling consequence, which Dante does not draw, but he arguably suspects and subliminally feels, is that the proximate real object of his love, after all, is only an ideal projected by his inner reflection. The immediate reality of Beatrice for him is only the Beatrice that he imagines. This realization about self-reflection as mediating all our conscious experience in the modern era is made the basis of modern subject-centered philosophy by Kant, with the transcendental unity of apperception. He's building on Descartes, the cogito. The I think frames and filters everything in human consciousness. In the phenomenological reduction of Husserl, the I can hold for certain only its own immediate perceptions. So when we reflect, we distinguish between the object itself and our subjective impressions of it, whereas the two are really indistinct in the immediacy of experience. Just as in the phenomenological reduction, reflection leads Dante, just as in the phenomenological reduction, reflection leads Dante to distinguish between what purely is and his own subjective impression of it. The latter is degraded to unreality in comparison with Beatrice's true, authentic reality, which, however, remains out of reach and ineffable. Reflection turns into a revelation of transcendence. It reveals the transcendence of Beatrice, her being beyond Dante. This is expressly Dante's conclusion at the end of the work, where he forswears all further word about Beatrice until such time as he should have more adequate means to speak of her. And this, I submit, is Dante's fundamental bequest to modernity in its radical realization of a secularization of religious revelation. Revelation of the subject to itself by self-reflection seems to give something immediate and graspable to be known, yet is grounded in the infinite and ungraspable. The real being of the subject escapes its own self-reflection, and the subject implodes and is open toward the infinite, which is what I'm calling the theological. And others might prefer to understand that in purely secular terms as revealment or disclosure. I propose that in any case, it is a negatively theological disclosure or revelation, since it relates to the all and infinite, which we cannot as such know. In this mode of reflection, everything in the finite universe is seen in the translucent light of a mystery that cannot as such be seen, but that nevertheless gives to be seen everything that is. A vast field of perception opens in which everything appears in relation to the infinite. This is how we're perceiving now, I think. The infinite itself not being perceptible. Concretely, this means that all things are perceived in a perspective of openness to their beyond, to their unlimited relations to other things. Everything that appears positively in our experience of the empirical world, of sensory things, is then understood as a negation of a higher reality that we relate to blindly. Self-reflection annihilates the self in itself and opens it in self-transcendence toward an ungraspable other. Such is the movement that Dante's textual relationship with Beatrice models and performs. Now there's a mesmerizing emblem of this in the of this dialectical interpenetration of self-reflection and otherness, or immanence and transcendence, in the Veronica. Dante alludes to it at the end of the Vita Nuova. in conjunction with the pilgrims who are on their way to Rome in order to see the blessed image of the Savior. Now, the article in question is a mere cloth that is supposed to have retained the imprint of Christ's face when Veronica wiped it for him along the way of Calvary, as he was of the cross, as he was mounting Calvary toward Golgotha. It becomes a holy relic that is treated according to a perhaps fanciful but widely accepted etymology as the true icon, vera icona of Christ. The Veronica thus presents a concrete object believed to carry the impress and to communicate the virtue of direct contact with divinity. It is the sensible token of a transcendent reality. Its positive presence as a cloth covers over the infinite absence of the divinity that it represents. As such a finite condensation of the infinite, it embodies a typical sort of religious and ritualistic impulse, such as animates also theological poetry, celebrating transcendent beauty in human words and sensations. And such poetry, in fact, is generated by reflection on what is believed to be a kind of absolute presence, yet any of the representations of that presence are knotted. So all representations are inadequate, the subject to being undermined by reflection, which comes to realize this fact. But it enables us to relate to this reality beyond all our representations by self-reflection on our own limits and there beyond. As revealed after the fact, Dante's education in love and poetry in the Vita Nuova has been in effect an induction into theology, albeit an existential theology. Encountering Beatrice is Dante's initiation into his own experience of the divine. The grounding of theological revelation in human encounter in Dante's magnum opus, The Divine Comedy, appears here in its first emergence, in embryo. It's in this sense that I take the Vita Nuova as the unsurpassed model for how literature in the modern era takes on a vocation of continuing and communicating religious revelation. So I propose to understand this book, it's Dante's first book, essentially the first book of Italian literature, as an inauguration of the modern era, but of an alternative modernity, such as we have never known. It challenges us to allow ourselves to be re-enchanted by divine revelation in our current age of disenchantment. And I think I have to end there. I wanted to sum up, but I'll leave it there then. Thank you.